The exact moment I knew the company was sliding into hell wasn't some dramatic boardroom blowup or a surprise layoff. It was when Dylan renamed the operations Slack channel to Vibe Central Call Me Hand. I was triple-checking federal compliance tags on our patent updates, while someone named Sash from BizDev asked if we could turn the monthly audit into a TikTok series. That's not satire. That was Tuesday. By the time Friday rolled around, I'd already done 3 people's jobs, including rewriting a botched client renewal packet that had somehow replaced our legal footer with a link to Dylan's personal blog. I'd fixed it, quietly. No applause, no bonus. Just another sticky note in the corner of my monitor labeled Dylan's disasters, fix later, and I was going to let it all slide. Really, I was. I've survived founders who chain vaped through all-hands meetings and PMs who cried over Jira boards. I don't get rattled. I'm Brenda Simmons, the quiet pillar, the one who'd been with the company since the second espresso machine had to be crowdfunded by interns. I built the back-end infrastructure, filed the early patents, even personally escorted the first compliance auditor out of the building when he tried to flirt with our CTO. You want things to stay afloat? You call me. I don't need a podium, I need version control and 2 monitors, and maybe a little love. So hey, if you're enjoying this already, and you're one of the 90% who listen without subscribing, go ahead and tap that button. Like it too. It honestly helps the team a lot more than you think. Now, back to our regularly scheduled descent into chaos. When Dylan took over, it was like someone had unleashed a swarm of startup cosplay influencers into a company that used to actually do things. Overnight, company culture pivoted from measured and methodical to let's circle back on that and move fast, break things, ghost the client. Dylan was 27, technically CEO by bloodline, not by merit. His father, Greg, our original founder, semi-retired after the Series C funding, handing the crown to his son like we were in some tech monarchy and not a living, breathing machine of deadlines and legal liability. Dylan didn't hate me. He just didn't see me. To him, I was legacy software, useful but outdated, part of Dad's era. He brought in new blood, a woman who once hosted a podcast called Brand Witch, a guy named Tyler who wore a beanie in July and ran strategy decks using emojis instead of data, and a chief of vibes. I wish I were kidding. My title, founding technical officer, meant little in the land of unlimited PTO and kombucha tap, but I still did the work. I was the bridge between engineering and legal, product and policy. I kept the patent filings clean, the documentation pristine, and the servers upright. When they needed me, I was a godsend. When they didn't, I became furniture. The kind you bump into during a keynote speech and pretend isn't there. I didn't complain. I didn't escalate. I kept notes. I had a digital folder labeled CYA and a private Slack channel with no members but me, where I logged every red flag, every NDA Dylan forwarded to interns for fun, every botched compliance export with my initials still at the bottom. I've seen tech bros implode under less. I was just documenting the trajectory. Meetings became theater. Dylan loved to pace while talking about disrupting our verticals. He once said we were going to make compliance sexy, which was rich coming from a man who thought SOC2 was a new crypto token. I sat in the back, eyes half-lidded, pen in hand, correcting his terminology in my notebook while the interns clapped at his metaphors. I didn't even bother correcting them anymore. It wasn't ignorance, it was performance. But under the surface, I felt something tightening, like the bolts holding the ship together were rusting from the inside. The sales team kept using expired pricing models. The CTO was exploring other projects and stopped showing up to stand-ups. Last 2 engineers who understood our core infrastructure had left quietly, and no one noticed because no one looked. No one except me. Then came the chatter. Dylan mentioning restructuring. A new org chart where my name was suddenly missing from the exec slide but still listed in legacy resources. The whispers in HR, the strange silence in the ops thread. One day I logged in and saw my permissions downgraded on 3 internal tools. No explanation. Just a quiet, bureaucratic muting. But I didn't panic. I updated my backups. I reviewed the agreement I'd signed with Greg a decade ago, the one nobody talks about because they assume old paperwork stops mattering after IPOs. That's where I found it again. Article Roman 4, Section 2F. A little clause with big teeth. The founding technical officer cannot be removed without unanimous consent of the board. A relic, but a binding one. I reread that line maybe 20 times. Not because I doubted it, but because I knew Dylan would. And when he did what he was about to do, I wouldn't scream or beg or whine on LinkedIn. I'd let the paper speak. The email hit my inbox at 6:03 p.m. No subject line warning, no discreet CC, no call beforehand. Just from Dylan R. Subject, cleaning house, body. Effective immediately, Brenda Simmons is no longer with the company. Thank her for her service and are excited to make space for new blood. Hash new era, I read it 3 times. I stared at it like it was written in Sanskrit, then I noticed the timestamp. Friday night, classic, no one around, no pushback, no follow-up, a surgical ghosting. The kind of move a coward thinks looks brave. And then the Slack channels began to flicker. My name vanished from engineering heritage, then from legal bridge, and finally from exec only. One by one, the lights started going out. I still didn't say a word. Instead, I stood up, walked to the supply cabinet, grabbed the box I'd labeled if the day ever comes, and began placing my things inside it. The handwritten compliance notes, the original R&D flowchart I'd drawn on printer paper in 2014, the mug from the first hackathon, the one Greg spilled Red Bull into and called holy water, and my backup drives. I kept one of those drives updated weekly. The other was set to archive everything related to patents, legal handoffs, and security protocols. I didn't even flinch, just unplugged them like I was wrapping up another Friday. And then I tried to badge out. The red light blinked, denied, tried again. Same thing. Third time, nothing. The security guard, new, young, trying not to look spooked, gave me a shrug like, I don't want to be part of this, ma'am. I walked around to the side exit where they hadn't updated access yet and stepped into the parking lot as the lights inside flickered to after-hours mode. No one followed, no one called. Dylan didn't even have the spine to speak to me in person. No exit interview, no final meeting, not even a pretense of protocol, just vibes and a hashtag. I sat in my car for a full minute before turning the key. I wasn't angry, not yet. Anger's a secondary emotion. What I felt was closer to clinical awareness, like spotting a virus in your bloodstream and calmly logging the symptoms. I'd seen Dylan chip away at stability for months, messing with hiring pipelines, approving shady budget shifts, whispering to VCs that we were outgrowing our legacy systems like I was a printer on its last cartridge. He didn't just fire me. He erased me, with the confidence of someone who's never been held accountable a day in his life. Dylan made a mistake. He assumed I was a relic. He assumed my silence was surrender. He assumed no one would care or remember that buried in the bones of this company was a clause so sharp it could cut him in half without anyone raising their voice. I got home by 6:41, made tea rooibos, sat at my kitchen table with the overhead light on, humming, pulled out the thick folder from my file cabinet, black binder, gold clip, tabs labeled founding docs, bylaws, gov, structure, and protections. There it was. Article Roman 4, Section 2F. The founding technical officer shall not be removed without unanimous consent of the board. It was signed. Notarized, dated. The ink still crisp like the paper knew it would one day be a weapon. I didn't even write a cover note. Just snapped a photo of the clause, attached it to an email, and typed two things into the subject line. Subject, per Article Roman 4. Section 2F2, lead counsel at Blackstone Venturescom, hit send. Then I closed the laptop. No post, no tweet, no rage spiral. I wasn't about to walk into the trap of making noise while he made moves. That's what amateurs do. Noise is for people without proof. Me, I had the clause. And while Dylan spent the weekend high-fiving his buddies over beers, talking about cleaning house, the walls of that very house were already starting to hum. The air changed. The temperature dropped, because whether he knew it or not, he hadn't fired me. He'd lit a fuse. The drive home was a kind of meditation. Engine humming, dashboard lights soft, no music. Just me, the sound of tires on asphalt, and the flickering thought that I'd just been erased in public by a man whose greatest professional achievement was inventing the phrase synergy sprint. I didn't call anyone, didn't text. The world would assume I was packing boxes and crying into HR's voicemail. But I wasn't mourning a job. I was calibrating. I'd built this company's nervous system. I knew where every nerve ended and where it would hurt the most to press. I knew which servers logged what, which policies required whose signature, which investor clauses were still live, and which ones expired when Greg's retirement papers went through. I knew that under every champagne-soaked leadership transition was a web of contracts signed by hands that never read the fine print. And in that fine print, buried like a live wire, was my protection. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sky was bruised purple. I poured another cup of tea, laid my laptop on the table, and opened my personal archive. The folder was labeled Founding Docs Backup. Inside, subfolders: governance, patents, insurance, IP assignments, shareholder agreements. I'd scanned every document myself. It wasn't paranoia, it was survival. Every time a new investor came on board, I made sure nothing in those pages changed. People forget, but paper doesn't. There it was, Shareholders Agreement V1.2 executed copy, signed by all 5 founding members, including Greg himself. I clicked through the annotations until I found the line I'd memorized years ago, Article Roman 4. Section 2F, the founding technical officer shall not be removed or reclassified without unanimous consent of the board of directors. I leaned back, lips curling slightly. That clause wasn't ceremonial. It existed because Greg once joked that he trusted me more than the board, and I'd replied, then put it in writing. He did. Dylan had never read it. I'd bet my next paycheck, if I still had one, he didn't even know it existed. That's the thing about inherited power. You think you own the house, but you never check if the foundation belongs to someone else. So I did what I do best, documented. I took a photo of the clause, clean and centered, no commentary, no flair. Then I opened a blank email, addressed it to lead counsel at Blackstone Venturescom, the law firm representing our largest investor, and attached the photo. Subject line per Article Roman 4, Section 2F. That's it. No body text, no threats, no sign off, just the clause and silence. Then I hit send. I sat there watching the little message sent notification vanish into the ether. No rush of adrenaline, no relief, just the same calm that settles in before a thunderstorm, because I knew what would happen next. Legal would forward it to the investor team. They'd pull the original docs from their archive. They'd verify the signatures. Then, sometime between now and Monday morning, the phrase potential governance breach would start floating through inboxes like smoke before a fire alarm. Dylan thought I'd disappear quietly, that I'd fade out like old code, replaced by someone with a tick-tock presence and a ring light. But he forgot that in a company built on contracts, words are weapons, and mine were already loaded. I closed my laptop, turned off the lights, and stared at the reflection in my kitchen window. Behind my shoulder, the glow of the screen faded out completely, leaving just me in the dark. I wasn't nervous, I wasn't bitter, I wasn't even angry anymore. I was steady like a metronome, like I'd been waiting for this song to finally reach the downbeat. I poured another cup of tea, Ruibos again, then almost absently opened my notebook and wrote one line at the top of a fresh page, unfired on paper. It looked clean, simple, elegant. By morning, that line would stop being a thought, it would become a fact. By Saturday morning, Dylan was already throwing himself a victory parade. On Slack, he posted in the Leadership Corner channel, "Time to clean up Dad's mess-flexed biceps, new era incoming." No mention of me. No mention of the fact that the so-called mess had kept this company solvent, compliant, and unsued for the better part of a decade. Just dopamine-fueled one-liners and emojis. The interns applauded with heart reacts. The rest of the senior team went conspicuously quiet. I watched it unfold from my couch, sipping coffee that didn't taste like burned startup dreams. My access to Slack was gone, of course, but I still had a few windows open before the systems team fully purged my sessions. I saw the thread. I saw Dylan's little selfie at some overpriced rooftop bar later that night, clinking glasses with some VC analyst who looked 12 and wrote "Fire big moves ahead" under the post. Dylan captioned it, "New era ops cleanup no dead weight." It was cute, and by cute I mean grotesquely short-sighted. Because right around the time he was double-fisting margaritas, I got a quiet ping in my inbox. The read receipt from the law firm. Someone had opened the attachment. The clause had been seen. Then nothing. No reply, no call, no CC thread. Just a silence that said, "We're checking something before we speak." That's the thing about lawyers. The more serious it gets, the quieter they become. I spent Sunday in my garden, pulled weeds, trimmed the roses, let the inbox sit. I didn't refresh it. I didn't chase an update. That's not how leverage works. You don't beg for recognition when you're holding the pin to a grenade. Monday morning, I checked my work calendar out of habit. Technically, I shouldn't have had access anymore. But the IT team, God bless them, was sloppy and overworked, and no one had revoked my backup calendar sync. That's when I saw it. Board session urgent compliance discussion. Attendees: Dylan, lead counsel; Greg, founder; Series B rep, CFO, HR. Time, Monday, 3 p.m. No agenda details. Just that single line, urgent compliance. That's how you know someone's spooked. Word urgent only shows up when an investor starts asking questions that can't be answered with buzzwords. I imagined the boardroom. Sleek wood table, overpriced water bottles, someone nervously shuffling papers while Dylan tries to look confident. Greg would be there, mostly silent, disappointed in a way only a father who let his kid burn down his legacy can be. The Series B rep, I'd met her. Sharp as a blade and allergic to chaos. She'd see the clause. She'd see the timestamps. She'd see the gap between Dylan's announcement and the actual vote that never happened. I wasn't in the room. I wasn't on the call. I wasn't in the building. And yet I was everywhere. I was in the bylaws. I was in the Slack logs. I was in the compliance schedule. I was the name on the IP portfolio that made half the company's valuation real. And now, I was the one variable that had been moved without permission. Dylan had made himself the hero of a PowerPoint fantasy. But I was the footnote with legal teeth. My phone stayed silent. I didn't expect anyone to reach out before the meeting. No one wants to admit they forgot the one person who understood how the bones of this place were welded together. They wanted to believe I was just some old process dinosaur who'd quietly move on. They didn't realize they'd fired a structural beam. Beams don't scream when you kick them, they just wait for the ceiling to fall. I opened a new note. Title: Board Fallout Predictions. Greg will stay neutral until liability is clear. Dylan will blame HR, legal, then me. Series B rep will request all documentation within 24 hours. Legal will start digging through Slack logs, HR timestamps, and vote records. The word breach will appear no later than 3:27 p.m. By 2:55 p.m., I'd already received a calendar ping on my personal account. Compliance document access request for review. No sender name, just an anonymous DocuShare link. They were checking the paper trail, and the thing about trails, they all lead somewhere. They started the meeting exactly at 3 p.m. because that's what people do when they're about to pretend everything's fine. On the surface, tidy Zoom squares, bottled water condensation beating in a quiet, air-conditioned boardroom, investors wearing that facial expression that screams I'm withholding judgment but barely. Underneath it, a bomb ticking down. The lead investor's lawyer, Harrison Cray, gray suit, zero charm, didn't even bother with pleasantries. No thanks for making the time, no soft intro. Just held up a crisp, single sheet of paper and said, before we begin, I'd like to read one clause aloud for the record. Dylan, already leaning back in his chair like he was auditioning for a documentary about visionary sons, raised an eyebrow and sipped from a drink that definitely wasn't water. Sure, go ahead, he said, with that breathy chuckle people use when they still think they're in control. Harrison didn't look at him. He read, Article Roman 4, Section 2, F. The founding technical officer shall not be removed or reclassified without unanimous consent of the board of directors. Silence, one beat, two. Greg, the CEO, Dylan's father, was present technically. His Zoom window was on mute, camera slightly angled, chin resting on one hand. He didn't blink, he didn't speak. Dylan's posture didn't shift, but his grip on the glass tightened. That sounds like a formality, he said, trying to laugh. I mean, we're not really leaning on those old clauses anymore, right? Isn't that from the first version? Wrong move. Series B rep, Dana Reeves, looked up from her notepad like a hawk spotting a limp mouse. We're bound by executed agreements, Dylan, she said, voice flat as concrete, not vibes, more silence. Greg finally unmuted his mic. I didn't vote, he said quietly. Not as an accusation, more like a regret. Dana's gaze didn't leave Dylan. Did anyone, Harrison, already flipping the paper over, answered for them? There is no record of a vote. No board minutes, no HR documentation, no official termination notice with director approval. In fact, he pulled another sheet from his binder. Ms. Simmons' share class includes contingent protections tied to breach of governance protocol. Specifically, she is entitled to both reinstatement and liquidated damages in the event of unlawful removal. Wait, Dylan began, but Dana cut in. Did you remove her without a vote, Dylan? He faltered. Well, technically, I issued a notice, but that was more symbolic. No internal morale, symbolic? Dana said, her voice now cold enough to fog glass. Dylan shifted again, trying to reach for confidence like it was a misplaced remote. I mean, we're in a transition period. We needed agility. We needed to act decisively. You needed a vote, Harrison said, not looking up, and you didn't get one. The weight of it started to settle. Brenda's absence, quiet, unacknowledged, was suddenly a canyon in the room. Her chair sat empty. She was everywhere. In the documents, in the infrastructure, in the language of the clause. She was the room's ghost, haunting them with paper and process. One of the junior board members glanced at their phone and tried to subtly edge it off-screen. Greg leaned back and sighed. Dana turned to HR, who looked like she wanted to melt into her chair. I assumed, HR began. There's no assumption in governance, Harrison replied. There is process. Dylan's jaw twitched. So what? Just going to undo everything? She's back because of a line in a document? Dana leaned forward. She never left. That's when it hit him. You could see it in the way his shoulders dropped an inch, his eyes flickered, his breathing changed. This wasn't a PR firestorm. This wasn't just going to be a Slack apology and a new ops manager named Dakota. This was a breach. And Brenda hadn't sent a single word beyond that email. She didn't need to. She had clause 2F. The boardroom went quiet again, not the stiff, corporate kind of silence. This one had heat behind it, the kind that simmers right before something breaks, the kind that makes people feel watched. Because the truth had finally landed and it made a sound louder than any scream. She hadn't been fired. She'd been betrayed on paper. And the paper was fighting back. Can you show us the record of the vote? Harrison asked, voice still level. But now with that razor-thin edge lawyers get when they smell blood in the water. Dylan blinked. What do you mean record? It was a leadership call, a decision. We didn't, he paused, realizing mid-sentence just how thin the ice was. Harrison didn't blink. To remove an executive officer under Clause 2F, you need a unanimous board vote. The bylaws require minutes, notification. A quorum, any of that ring a bell. Dana crossed her arms and glanced toward the far end of the conference room. So you're saying there's no vote? No email? No record of board consent? Dylan opened his laptop and started clicking furiously, as if somewhere, buried beneath a dozen browser tabs and half-written emails, there might magically appear a PDF that could save him from himself. Look, I sent the termination notice to HR. That's protocol, he said. They were supposed to document it. Everyone turned to the head of HR, Marla, who looked like someone had just dropped a live scorpion in her lap. We received an email after hours on Friday, she said carefully. It just said, remove Brenda Simmons from the org chart, deactivate her access. No mention of board review, no supporting documentation, no termination packet, nothing signed. The CFO, who'd been silent until now, leaned forward. That doesn't meet any of our compliance standards. That doesn't even meet basic decency. Zoom chat started popping off in the corner of the call like popcorn in a microwave. One director messaged, did you approve this? Another, we need a risk assessment today. Then another, this is exposure. Major exposure. Someone muted their mic and stood up, pacing just off screen. You could hear a chair squeak, a door open. Panic was seeping in now, slow, like carbon monoxide. Dylan tried to hold the line. Come on, we're getting lost in semantics. The point is, we're moving forward with new leadership. Legacy roles had to be, Greg's voice came through, unmuted for the first time in 20 minutes. Stop calling her legacy. The words hit like a slap. Greg, once Dylan's biggest champion, now sounded like a man ashamed of his own creation. She built the protocols you're now violating, Greg continued. She signed off on our first 5 patents. She's the reason this company even survived the early audits. Don't reduce her to a line item you thought you could delete. Dylan's screen flickered slightly, camera lag, or maybe just nerves. He swallowed. Dad, I didn't vote, Greg interrupted. None of us did. You moved without authority. That's a governance breach, son, and you know what that means. Silence. Not the stunned kind from before, this was heavier. Final. Arla shifted in her seat. Also, compliance logs confirm that there was no formal HR workflow initiated. No severance paperwork, no meeting scheduling, no offboarding protocol. Just a manual badge deactivation order, timestamp 6:12 p.m. Friday. That's it, and the Slack post? Dana asked. Marla nodded, came 4 minutes later. Public, unapproved. Harrison sighed, leaned back in his chair, and folded the printout in half. Without a vote. The termination is invalid, he said simply. Everything that followed is now potentially reversible or worse, liable. Dylan finally stopped typing. His hands just hovered over the keyboard, frozen. The air around him seemed to get thicker. His face, once smug and flushed with rooftop tequila and hashtags, now looked pale, pinched, because he finally understood. Brenda didn't have to speak. She didn't leak anything. Didn't send a single dramatic email. Didn't call a reporter or post on LinkedIn with a crying emoji and a paragraph about betrayal. She just forwarded a clause, and now the board was unraveling. His father had turned. The investors were whispering. Legal had nothing to work with. And somewhere, probably in her kitchen, probably with a cup of tea, Brenda Simmons was watching it all fold in on itself, calm as ever. Because silence isn't weakness when the paperwork screams for you. And Dylan was about to learn what it really meant to clean house, when the foundation sues you back. Harrison unfolded a second sheet from his binder and smoothed it out like he was preparing a surgical instrument. The room had fallen into the kind of silence where even the ambient noise, the faint hum of HVAC, the distant buzz of a phone, sounded intrusive. He tapped the paper with one finger. There's more, he said. This isn't just about reinstatement or invalid termination. Her removal without proper board procedure constitutes a material breach of the governance agreement signed during Series B. Specifically, it violates the key personnel clause. Dylan blinked, still rooted in place, like if he didn't move, maybe the hole he dug wouldn't collapse all the way in. Dana looked up. That clause is tied to our insurance covenants. Harrison nodded. Correct. Miss Simmons is listed explicitly under Schedule K as a key risk officer. Removing her without transition protocol or a qualified interim triggers a compliance notification to the insurer. Meaning what? Dylan croaked. Meaning, Harrison said, that our directors and officers' liability coverage may be suspended pending review. And if they find cause, that exposure becomes personal. A dull sound echoed as someone set their water bottle down a little too hard. One of the junior board members leaned forward, hands folded, face pale. But Harrison wasn't done. In addition, he continued, flipping to yet another sheet. Her equity package contains a clause added post-series as part of a risk retention incentive. It states that any involuntary removal deemed unlawful under company bylaws triggers immediate 100% vesting of remaining shares, plus a liquidation event multiplier if litigation is required. Dylan's mouth opened, then closed. No sound came out. Greg spoke next. His voice low, gravelly. That clause was mine. We added it because we knew someday someone would forget how this place was built. It's not just the shares, Harrison added, unflinching. We're talking about intellectual property she contributed to, directly or indirectly. If her removal is invalid, we may not be able to use any new filings or product rollouts initiated post-termination without her consent. Dana leaned back in her chair like she needed to look at the ceiling to process what was unfolding. We'd need her signature for retroactive patent clearance, she murmured. And if this gets flagged in audit, the insurer will pull forward everything from Q2. The CFO, who had stayed quiet through most of the meeting, finally stood. So we're not just exposed legally. We're exposed on valuation. He turned to Dylan. What do you think happens if this hits the LPs? If the audit log shows we removed a named key officer without a vote, without process, without even a paper trail? Dylan looked like someone had pulled the floor out from under him and replaced it with a spreadsheet printed in red ink. I didn't know, he mumbled. I didn't see that clause. I thought you thought? Greg snapped. You thought this was a brand refresh, not a governance structure. Dylan tried to speak, but Greg kept going. You wanted to make a statement? Congratulations. You just exposed us to a multi-million-dollar compliance breach, a class of unvested shares we now owe in full, and a risk officer claim that could kill half our contract eligibility. Marla from HR looked like she was trying to sink into her chair. What do we do? Harrison answered quietly. We stop the bleeding. We acknowledge the breach. We reinstate her immediately. And we pray she's in a forgiving mood. Is she litigious? One of the investors asked. Dana answered that one. She doesn't have to be. She's methodical, and she has every document we're now scrambling to find. Dylan stared straight ahead. She sent one email. Greg nodded, and she didn't need to send another. That's the difference between a founder and a fraud. Dylan's hands were shaking, just enough for me to imagine it through the screen. That was always the thing with him. He only planned for applause, never for silence. And now the silence around my name was deafening. I wasn't in the room, but I was in the clauses. I was in the architecture. I was in the risk tables, the patent index, the retention metrics, the early voting share class no one double-checked before swinging an axe. I wasn't gone. I was everywhere. And the more they dug, the more they'd realize, you can't fire the blueprint. The next name in the Zoom waiting room wasn't someone you wanted to see unless you were filing a claim or receiving one. Trish Holleran, Senior Risk Counsel, Calix Insurance Group. Black suit, dark lipstick, unreadable eyes. Dana let her in with a sigh that practically fogged the camera. Thanks for joining us, Miss Holleran, Harrison said, standing up to give her the floor, as though the mere presence of insurance counsel had sucked all oxygen from the room. I'll be brief, Trish said, scanning the screen. As you're aware, under the Series B Key Personnel Agreement, Ms. Simmons' removal required procedural compliance with outlined governance steps. As of this morning, we have not received confirmation of those steps. Dylan leaned forward, voice strained. Look, it was a Friday decision. Things move fast in startups. We didn't think it would trigger this level of response. Trish didn't blink. You didn't think it would trigger an insurance clause you signed under indemnity obligation? Harrison cleared his throat and handed it off. I've reviewed the documentation. There was no board vote, no minutes, no documented motion or signed resolution. The CFO, pale and increasingly quiet since the last call, finally spoke up. We never saw a termination vote on the agenda. Not once, not even informal approval, Trish asked. Nothing, the CFO said. I checked every calendar, every board recap, every note. Her name just disappeared. Trish turned slightly. So, who authorized it? Dylan started to open his mouth, but Trish held up a hand. Not interested in opinion. I want names, I want timestamps. HR, who had been silent for 10 straight minutes, finally squeaked out, we received an instruction at 6:05 p.m. No accompanying files, just a Slack message that said, remove Brenda. Immediately, legacy roles must go. Trish turned to Dylan. That message came from your account. It was a policy shift, Dylan said. I was acting in a leadership capacity. You were acting in breach, Trish snapped. This isn't a reorg, this is non-compliance. Dylan pointed weakly toward HR. They should have confirmed with legal before executing. Marla snapped her head up. You told us it was pre-approved by the board, that the lawyers had reviewed it. You said, quote, I'm not asking for feedback, just handle it. Dana looked like she just aged 3 fiscal quarters in one meeting. She turned toward Harrison, her voice dangerously flat. If our D&O policy is suspended over this, how much exposure are we looking at? Harrison rubbed his temples, high 7 figures, and that's assuming Brenda doesn't file a suit. She won't, Greg muttered. She doesn't have to because I wasn't there. I wasn't screaming or emailing or grandstanding on Twitter. I hadn't even sent a follow-up. I'd sent one email, and they were bleeding out because of it. Every silence was now haunted by my absence. My name didn't have to be on the call log to dominate the conversation. I was the uninvited guest standing behind everyone's shoulder, built into the bones of the system they were now trying to pretend I'd never been part of. But the system remembered, the architecture remembered, the insurance remembered. Trish tapped her pen on the table. My team will be issuing a hold on coverage until our internal review concludes. In the meantime, any contracts executed under the pretense of Brenda Simmons' removal will be considered conditional and subject to retroactive rejection. That includes, she paused for emphasis, all contracts tied to IP development post-Friday. Dana inhaled sharply. Jesus. No, Trish said, just governance, Harrison sighed. Next step is reinstatement protocol. Immediate, retroactive, with full acknowledgement of error and damages, asked the Series B rep, now visibly distressed. That depends, Harrison replied, on whether Brenda wants blood or just boundaries. Greg folded his arms. If you'd asked me 3 days ago, I'd have said she was the most reasonable person in the company. Dylan slumped back in his chair, sweating through his button down. His empire of hashtags and brand resets was burning in slow motion, and there wasn't a bucket in sight. Because when you build a castle out of ego, and forget the engineer who designed the foundation, you don't just risk collapse, you guarantee it, and I hadn't even needed to show up. The boardroom was as quiet as I'd ever imagined it, quieter than any silence I'd heard in my years inside those walls. No typing, no throat clearing, no calendar pings, just that slow, dull dread settling over every chair, one by one. The kind of silence that means consequences have arrived, and they brought receipts. Harrison stood now. No theatrics, no raised voice, just holding the same piece of paper he'd introduced back in Part 5 like it was the 10 Commandments carved in litigation-grade stone. He glanced down at it once more, then looked around the table. His voice, low and final, per Article Roman 4, Section 2, F of the shareholder agreement, the founding technical officer cannot be removed or reclassified without unanimous consent of the board. So I'll ask. For the record, who voted? The room stayed still. A junior board member blinked, then lowered their eyes to their phone. Another rubbed the bridge of their nose like they were trying to erase themselves from existence. The cursor blinked on Dylan's screen. He didn't move. Finally, Greg unmuted. His face looked older than it had last week, paler. Like watching this unfold had aged him in real time. I didn't, he said. One sentence. No elaboration. Dana turned her head slightly, as if checking the air pressure had suddenly changed. The lead investor, who hadn't spoken since the insurance council logged off, shook his head. Neither did I, he said. Not then, not now. Harrison nodded. Then her removal is invalid. He turned toward the board secretary, who looked like she might pass out. Note that for the record, termination was unauthorized. Brenda Simmons remains the founding technical officer, effective continuously, and under the terms of her equity clause, she is now entitled to immediate vesting of all remaining shares plus statutory damages. He let that sit for a breath, then added like a final nail into wet cement, this constitutes breach. You could hear Dylan's world collapse behind his eyes. The breath left his lungs like a tire going flat. No one moved to defend him, not HR, not Greg, not Dana, not even his own damn Slack channel. Greg glanced down, then quietly shut his laptop. Dana simply said, I'll schedule a vote for temporary suspension pending review. Dylan's voice, when it finally emerged, cracked under the weight of its own irrelevance. You can't be serious. This is just paperwork. It's outdated. Harrison didn't even turn to face him. It's governance, he said, and it's binding. There was no dramatic outrow, no HR escort, no gasping crowd. Just a slow administrative decapitation, the kind that doesn't make headlines but ends careers all the same. While they scrambled to draft reinstatement language, notify the insurer, and lock Dylan out of financial systems, I was at home. Laptop open, tea warm. At 6:12 p.m., I received one notification. Systems your company access has been restored. Message from IT, welcome back. No emoji, no exclamation point, just a line of code and consequence. I logged in. Everything was still there. My documentation folder, my admin permissions, my Slack archive with Dylan's Friday message still timestamped. And at the top of my bookmarks bar, a folder labeled Phase 2, I clicked it open. Inside, notes, logs, timeline estimates, contingency plans, not revenge, just reality, preloaded and timestamped. Because I knew this moment would come. Maybe not this week, maybe not this way, but it was always coming. Not because I wished it into existence, because Dylan earned it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't leak screenshots or write a manifesto. I enforced the rules. I let the silence speak, and the silence roared. Big thanks for watching, you sneaky seniors. Subscribe to keep the coffee pot brewing revenge. Your ex-colleagues won't know what hit 'em.